Every morning just after 7, Martha moved through her little house with the rhythm of someone who had been alone long enough to make silence feel like company. She boiled water in a dented silver kettle, picked the same floral teacup from the second shelf, and sat in the same wooden chair by the lace-covered window. Outside, the trees whispered to no one in particular. Inside, the walls listened patiently. But before she did anything else, before reading the paper, feeding the birds, or folding her apron, Martha always walked into her bedroom and gently wiped down the mirror. It wasn't that the mirror was dirty. It wasn't even that she cared much about her reflection anymore. It was the ritual of it, the care, the way the cloth moved across the glass like a memory she didn't want to forget how to feel. She never stared into it for long. A glance was enough. There, staring back at her, was a face she had lived in for 82 years. Lines like soft rivers curved around her eyes. A mouth that had once sung lullabies and whispered secrets now rested in a quiet stillness. Martha didn't mind aging. What she minded was the way the world began to look through her instead of at her. The way her name was still hers, but no one had spoken it with warmth in so long that it began to feel borrowed. Sometimes the mirror felt like the only thing left that remembered her without having to be reminded. It didn't ask questions. It didn't correct her stories. It didn't tell her she was forgetting. Just reflected. That morning, like every morning for the past 30 years, Martha wiped the edges of the glass, straightened the wooden frame, and whispered quietly, "Still here." Then she turned and left the room, not because she was done looking, but because she wasn't sure what else she hoped to find. Martha's house sat quietly at the corner of a street few people remembered by name. It wasn't grand. It wasn't new. But it had been faithful. A keeper of her hours, her echoes in her soft footsteps. The wallpaper in the hallway had faded into a gentle whisper of roses. The floorboards creaked, but only where the years had leaned into them with love. There was a clock in the kitchen that no longer ticked, but still hung proudly, as if time had chosen to pause there out of respect. In the living room, a bookshelf leaned slightly, filled with novels whose pages had grown brittle and yellowed with age. Some were bookmarked with grocery receipts from the 80s. Some were underlined in pencil, soft feminine handwriting that had once belonged to a younger Martha with a restless mind and a heart full of questions. The dining table still had 4 chairs, though only one had been used for the past 3 decades. The other 3 remained, not for visitors but for memory. One chair still held the indent of Thomas's presence. Her husband, gone now nearly 30 years. Another had belonged to her sister, who used to visit on Sundays and bring lemon pie. The third was never truly claimed, but Martha never moved it. Perhaps she hoped it was waiting for someone she hadn't yet met. Every drawer in the house knew her hands. Every doorknob turned with the same rhythm. The curtains danced in the breeze like they had always done, not just to let light in, but to remind her the world still moved beyond the glass. And yet something had begun to change. Not in the house, but in Martha. She had started pausing longer in front of the bookshelf, letting her fingers rest on spines she hadn't touched in years. She'd found herself humming tunes she hadn't heard since Thomas was alive. She even left the back door unlocked one morning, not by accident but by quiet, trembling intention. The house had always waited for her, but now it felt as if the house was waiting with her, for what she couldn't yet name. But there was a stirring, a kind of memory that wasn't backward but forward. And it had something to do with the mirror. She could feel it. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that forgets it's part of the week. Too quiet to be Monday, too early to mean anything. Martha had just finished her tea, rinsed her cup, and returned to her bedroom with the same soft steps she took every morning. The sun filtered gently through the lace curtains, scattering soft light on the floor like spilled milk. She picked up the cloth to wipe the mirror, just as she always did. Top left corner, slow circle, then down. It was muscle memory by now, a rhythm her hands had memorized better than any dance. But this time, as she wiped the lower edge of the frame, something shifted, a faint cracking sound, like old wood sighing from being noticed. Startled, Martha leaned in. The corner of the frame, long since painted over and polished, had pulled slightly away from the mirror itself. It wasn't broken, not truly, but something behind the glass caught her eye. She bent closer, her fingers trembling not with fear, but with the fragile reverence of stumbling upon something that wasn't meant to be found yet. Wedged between the frame and the backing was the edge of a folded paper, yellowed, pressed thin by time. She didn't remember putting anything there. Carefully, she loosened the nails holding the back in place, each one reluctant as if they too had sworn to keep a secret. And then the paper slipped into her palm. It was soft and fragile, like something that had held its breath for years. There in faded blue ink was a name, Martha A. Lane, and just below it, a date, June 3, 1994. Martha sat down slowly on the edge of her bed. The house was silent, not in its usual peaceful way, but in a waiting way, the kind of quiet that leans in to listen. She unfolded the paper. It was a letter, written in her own handwriting, to herself. Her breath caught. Her heart knew it before her eyes did. She had forgotten, but her past self had not. And the woman who had once written these words had something to say to the woman who had lived alone ever since. "Dear me," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I suppose you made it." Martha blinked slowly. Her eyes scanned the lines as if she were looking into a mirror that reflected not her face, but her memory, or rather, a version of herself she had once been brave enough to speak to. The handwriting was hers, unmistakably, looping, slightly rushed. The kind of script she used when her hands were still strong and her thoughts ran ahead of her pen. "You're probably wondering why this is hidden," the letter continued. "Well, I figured if I handed it to you, you'd just laugh and throw it away. So I left it somewhere only you would find. When you were ready." Martha's lips parted, but no words came. The letter spoke like an old friend who had never left, just gone quiet for a while. "I know what you're doing right now. You're probably sitting in that same room, sipping from the same cup, walking the same floors. And that's okay. But I just wanted to remind you of something. Something you promised not to forget." Her eyes began to sting, but she kept reading. "You were a woman with dreams once. Big ones. You wanted to write, to paint, to plant a garden so wild the neighbors would whisper about it. You were never afraid of growing old, you were afraid of not growing. And look at you. Have you stopped blooming?" Martha's hand trembled slightly, the paper soft as breath between her fingers. "You told yourself that love dying didn't mean life ended. But sometimes silence is louder than grief, isn't it?" There was no anger in the words, no bitterness, just gentle truth, the kind that comes not from judgment but from knowing. "I hope you still hum when the tea is steeping. I hope you still leave the porch light on. I hope you still cry when the garden first turns green in spring." Martha smiled faintly. She hadn't cried in spring for a long time. "And if you've forgotten who you are, that's okay. I remembered for you. Now read this as many times as you need, and then go find the part of you that wrote it. She's still in there. She's still waiting." It ended without a signature, just a small drawing in the corner. A sketch of a flower opening its petals to the morning sun. Martha didn't speak. She didn't move. But something deep inside her, something buried beneath the years of routine and resignation, exhaled. She folded the letter slowly, carefully, tenderly, as if sealing a promise not from the past but for the future. The letter stayed on Martha's bedside table that night. She didn't put it away in a drawer. She didn't hide it again. She left it there unfolded, as if it too needed air and light after so many years in the dark. The next morning, Martha rose earlier than usual. There was a stillness in the house, but it no longer felt like silence, felt like invitation. She brewed her tea but didn't sit by the window. She didn't reach for the newspaper or her knitting needles. Instead, she slipped on her worn shoes, the ones with dirt still clinging to the soles, and walked toward the back door. The hinges groaned a little, surprised by their use. She stepped into the backyard, where nothing had grown in over a decade. The garden, once a proud patch of blooms and herbs, was now a faded memory of green, replaced by weeds and wind. But beneath the neglect, the bones of it remained. The old wooden borders, the curve of the path, the small bench with its cracked white paint. Martha walked slowly through the space. She knelt beside a patch where lavender used to grow. She pressed her fingers into the soil. It was dry but not dead. She remembered where she used to plant daisies, where the rosemary thrived, where Thomas once built her a trellis for climbing roses. And then, for the first time in many, many years, Martha fetched the rusted spade from the shed. She worked slowly, carefully. Her movements were not as swift as they once were, but they were deliberate, steady, like someone remembering a dance from long ago. By afternoon, her hands were covered in earth, and her knees ached, but she smiled. Not because the garden was restored, it wasn't. Not yet, but because it had been remembered, acknowledged, touched again by someone who still believed it could bloom. That night, she returned to the letter. She traced the flower drawn at the bottom with her fingertip, then reached for a notebook from the drawer. It was mostly empty, pages yellowed with time. On the first page she wrote, "Today I touched the earth again. My hands remembered before my heart did." Then she closed the book gently and placed it beside the letter. 2 pages from 2 lifetimes, and yet somehow from the same woman. It started with a voice over the fence. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you planting something?" Martha looked up, shielding her eyes from the late morning sun. On the other side of the fence stood a young boy, maybe 9 or 10, holding a bicycle by the handlebars. He had scruffy hair, mismatched socks, and the kind of bold curiosity only childhood permits. She smiled, surprised by how natural it felt to do so. "Just trying to see if the ground still remembers me," she said. The boy grinned. "My grandma used to say that flowers remember people too." He rode off before she could ask his name. The next morning, a small flower pot appeared on her porch, with a note scrawled in pencil. "For the ground to remember better." It was a marigold, already blooming. Martha chuckled. She hadn't chuckled in months. The sound startled even the teapot in her hands. That afternoon, while watering the marigold, she noticed a woman watching from the sidewalk. Late 20s, maybe 30. She held a baby on her hip and wore tiredness like a sweater she couldn't take off. "Sorry," the woman called out. "I hope I'm not staring. It's just seeing someone work in a garden again. It feels nice." Martha wiped her hands on her apron. "It is nice," she said simply. The next day, the woman returned with a tray of seedlings, basil, mint, and thyme. "I always buy too much," she said, placing them gently on Martha's steps. "Thought maybe they'd be happier here." And just like that, the garden stopped being hers alone. Neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years began nodding from across the street. A child dropped off sunflower seeds, because they grow fast and don't get bored. Someone left a jar of fresh soil with a bough on top. Another passed on extra gloves, just in case. No one stayed long. No one intruded. But their gestures, small, quiet, sincere, formed a gentle circle around Martha. Not of noise, but of presence. In a world that often forgets to notice the elderly, she was suddenly being seen. The garden, half dug and humble, became a silent meeting place, a patch of shared hope. And though she never asked anyone to join her, Martha began to set out a second cup of tea each morning, just in case. Because sometimes connection doesn't come with grand announcements. Sometimes it arrives like a marigold on your doorstep. The mirror was still there, framed in the same worn wood, positioned across from the lace-draped window that caught the late morning light. But Martha noticed something had changed. Not in the glass, not exactly, but in the woman it showed. For years, the mirror had been a quiet companion, reflecting a face she had grown used to avoiding. A face softened by years in solitude. A face that, for a long time, looked back at her with a kind of question she never wanted to answer. But now, she stood before it differently. There was earth beneath her nails, a smudge of soil across her forearm, a slight sun-kissed flush to her cheeks she hadn't seen in decades. The lines around her eyes were still there, but they no longer looked like endings. They looked like parentheses wrapped around joy, like the soft folds of a story well told. And something else. Her shoulders sat taller. Her gaze lingered longer. There was a steadiness to the way she regarded herself, as if she had been reintroduced to someone she thought had long moved on. She ran her fingers along the edge of the frame, pausing at the spot where the crack had revealed the letter. "I see you now," she whispered. Not to the mirror, to herself. The house behind her was quiet, but not empty. On the kitchen counter sat a jar of wildflowers, left by the woman with the baby. A child's drawing of a sunflower was tacked to the fridge. Her notebook, once nearly blank, now held pages filled with small reflections, fragments of thought, lines of memory, ideas for what to plant next. Martha realized something else too. She was no longer waiting, not for company, not for purpose, Not even for memory. She was simply living. Again. Still. Always. And the mirror, faithful as ever, finally reflected not just her face but her becoming. Spring turned into summer with the gentlest of sighs, and Martha's garden, once quiet and forgotten, now stirred with color and breath. It wasn't perfect. Some patches were still bare. Some seeds hadn't sprouted. But in the places where she had touched the soil with her hands, something always grew. Lavender leaned into the breeze again. Mint pushed through the earth like a child finally brave enough to step forward. Sunflowers rose tall along the back fence, their faces unapologetically turned to the sun. Every morning, Martha walked barefoot across the path. She had started doing that in late May, not for any particular reason, except it made her feel real, present, connected. Neighbors still came, sometimes just to wave, sometimes to sit on the bench beside her in comfortable silence. Children peeked over the fence and asked, "What's that flower called?" She never minded not knowing the answer. Sometimes they named it themselves: Dreamflower, Wishleaf, Grandma's Smile. She liked those names best. One evening, just as the sun was folding itself into the horizon, Martha sat by the rosemary bush, the one Thomas had planted for her all those years ago. She closed her eyes. She could still hear his laugh, still remember the way his fingers smelled like thyme and newspaper. She missed him. Of course she did. But grief, once a shadow that followed her, now felt more like a companion. Quiet, respectful, always there but never in the way. Her notebook rested on her lap. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "The garden didn't forget me. It just waited for me to remember myself." She paused, then added, "Some things don't need to be healed, just tended to, gently, with love." The sky darkened, and the first stars blinked open like soft affirmations. Inside the house, the mirror waited. So did the letter. So did the cup of tea she had brewed for one, but always set out as two. But for now, Martha remained in the garden, listening, breathing, blooming.